Deep in the mountains, far from civilization, lived Carter Reeves, a man who had built walls not just around his cabin, but around his heart. Once a ruthless businessman, Carter had thrived on power and control, crushing anyone who stood in his way. But after a series of betrayals and financial ruin, he lost everything. Instead of seeking redemption, he retreated into isolation, convinced that the world was as cruel and unforgiving as he had been. He survived by taking from the land without care, setting traps for animals, and turning away any lost traveler who dared approach his cabin. Over the years, his name had become a whispered warning among the locals, a man as cold as the winter that blanketed the mountains. One stormy night, loud scratching at his door startled him from his brooding thoughts. Expecting trouble, Carter grabbed his rifle, ready to defend himself and his solitude. But when he flung open the door, he was met with an unexpected sight. A massive bear, injured and barely standing. At first, Carter saw it as a threat, his finger tightening on the trigger. But something in the bear's eyes unsettled him, a flicker of vulnerability that he recognized all too well. Instead of attacking, the bear let out a low moan and collapsed at his feet, its breaths labored and shallow. Carter stood frozen, his mind warring between old instincts and a strange pull he couldn't quite understand. He had spent years hardening his heart, refusing to let anything or anyone in. Yet here was this creature, broken and helpless, at his mercy. With a heavy sigh, he lowered his rifle and stepped out into the rain, knowing that his next choice would shape the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The bear was heavy, its fur matted with blood and mud as Carter dragged it into his cabin. He laid it down by the fireplace, the warmth of the crackling flames a stark contrast to the cold emptiness that usually filled the space. Carter stood back, watching the rise and fall of the bear's chest, wondering what had possessed him to bring a wild animal into his home. He had always prided himself on his self-sufficiency, on his ability to survive without relying on anyone else. But now, faced with this wounded creature, he felt a flicker of something he had long since buried, a sense of responsibility, a desire to help. Shaking his head, he pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. Carter gathered supplies, bandages, antiseptic, and a needle and thread. He had some experience patching up his own injuries over the years, a necessity of his isolated existence. But as he knelt beside the bear, he hesitated, unsure of where to begin. The bear's breaths were shallow, its eyes closed, and for a moment, Carter wondered if it was already too late. But then, as if sensing his presence, the bear's eyes fluttered open, meeting Carter's gaze. There was a depth there, an intelligence that caught him off guard. It was as if the bear could see straight through him, past the walls he had so carefully constructed. Carter swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to clean the wounds. As he worked, his mind drifted to his own past, to the choices that had led him to this moment. He had once been a man of ambition, driven by a hunger for success and power, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had pushed away those who cared for him, sacrificing relationships for the sake of his own gain. And in the end, it had all come crashing down, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. Now, as he tended to the bear's injuries, Carter couldn't help but wonder if this was his chance at redemption, a way to atone for his past mistakes. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that he would have to confront the demons he had been running from for so long. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to heal not just the bear, but himself as well. As the days turned into weeks, Carter fell into a new routine. He would wake early, check on the bear's progress, and then set out into the mountains to gather food and supplies. The bear was slowly healing, its wounds closing and its strength returning. But it was the change in Carter himself that was most remarkable. He found himself talking to the bear, sharing stories of his past and his regrets. It was strange, confiding in a creature that couldn't understand his words, but somehow, it felt right. The bear would watch him with those intelligent eyes, as if absorbing every word, and Carter felt a connection he had never experienced before. The townspeople, who had once feared and despised Carter, started to take notice of the change. They would see him in the distance, walking through the woods with a new sense of purpose, and whisper amongst themselves. Some were skeptical, convinced that a man like Carter could never truly change. But others saw a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption. One day, as Carter was returning from a supply run, he found a young woman waiting outside his cabin. She was shivering in the cold, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. Carter hesitated, his old instincts telling him to turn her away, to protect his solitude. But something in her face reminded him of the bear, of the vulnerability he had seen in those eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need help. My father, he's sick. We have no medicine, no way to get to town. I heard that you might be able to help." Carter stared at her, his mind racing. He had spent so long pushing people away, convinced that he was better off alone. But now, faced with this plea for help, he felt a stirring in his heart. He glanced back at the cabin, where he knew the bear was resting, and made a decision. "Come inside," he said gruffly, stepping aside to let her pass. "I have some supplies that might help." As he gathered the medicine and food, Carter couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose, a reason for his existence beyond mere survival. He handed the supplies to the young woman, watching as relief washed over her face. "Thank you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. I don't know how to repay you." Carter shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Just take care of your father," he said softly, "and maybe tell people that I'm not the monster they think I am." The young woman nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. As she turned to leave, Carter felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a sense of connection he had never known before. He watched her disappear into the woods, knowing that his life would never be the same. As the bear continued to heal, Carter found himself spending more and more time in its company. He would sit beside it, reading aloud from the few books he had brought with him into isolation. The bear would watch him, its eyes bright with interest, and Carter felt a sense of peace he had never known before. But as the bear grew stronger, Carter knew that the time was approaching when he would have to let it go. The thought filled him with a strange sense of loss, a realization that he had come to depend on the creature's presence in a way he had never anticipated. One evening, as the sun was setting over the mountains, Carter sat beside the bear, his hand resting gently on its fur. The bear turned its head, meeting his gaze, and Carter felt a lump forming in his throat. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know if I'm ready to be alone again." The bear let out a soft huff, as if in understanding, and leaned into Carter's touch. Carter closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the bear's body, the steady beat of its heart. He knew that he had to be strong, that he had to let the bear return to the wild, where it belonged. But as he sat there, lost in thought, a sudden commotion outside the cabin jolted him back to reality. He heard shouting, the sound of heavy footsteps, and a sense of dread washed over him. He stood up, grabbing his rifle, and moved cautiously towards the door. As he stepped outside, he was met with a sight that made his blood run cold. A group of men, armed with guns and traps, were making their way towards the cabin. At their head was a man Carter recognized all too well, a ruthless poacher who had been hunting in the mountains for years, taking animals without regard for the balance of nature. Carter's grip tightened on his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he had to protect the bear, that he had to stand up to the poacher and his men. But he also knew that he was outnumbered and outgunned, that he was facing a battle he might not be able to win. As the poacher approached, a cruel smile on his face, Carter took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. He had spent years running from his past, from the responsibility of his actions. But now, faced with this ultimate test, he knew that he had to make a choice, to revert to his old ways, looking out only for himself, or to take a stand, proving that real strength lay in protecting those who could not protect themselves. The poacher's eyes glinted with malice as he surveyed Carter, taking in the rifle clutched in his hands. Well, well, he drawled, his voice dripping with contempt. If it isn't the infamous Carter Reeves. I heard you'd gone soft, started taking in strays. Carter's jaw clenched, his finger tightening on the trigger. This is my land, he said, his voice low and steady. You have no right to be here. The poacher laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the mountains. Right, he sneered. The only right that matters out here is the right of the strong. And from where I'm standing, you don't look so strong anymore. Carter's eyes narrowed, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the poacher was trying to goad him, to provoke a reaction. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not now, not when the bear's life was at stake. I'm warning you, he said, his voice rising. Leave now, and I won't have to hurt you. The poacher's men shifted uneasily, glancing at their leader for guidance. But the poacher himself only smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent shivers down Carter's spine. You think you can hurt me? He asked softly, taking a step forward. You, who have spent years hiding away in these mountains, licking your wounds? You, who have never had the courage to face the consequences of your actions. Carter flinched, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He knew that the poacher was right, that he had spent too long running from his past. But he also knew that he had changed, that the bear had shown him a different way to live. I'm not that man anymore, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I've learned that there are things worth fighting for, things worth protecting. The poacher's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. And what exactly are you protecting? Reeves? He asked, his voice dripping with false sincerity. A mangy bear that's probably better off dead? Or maybe it's something else entirely. Carter's heart skipped a beat, a sense of unease washing over him. He knew that the poacher was fishing for information, trying to find a weakness to exploit. But he also knew that he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. It doesn't matter, he said firmly, squaring his shoulders. What matters is that you and your men leave. Now, before things get ugly. The poacher's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on his own rifle. Oh, things are already ugly, Reeves, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. And they're about to get a whole lot uglier. The standoff seemed to stretch on for an eternity, the tension thick in the air. Carter's mind raced, trying to find a way out of the situation without bloodshed. He knew that he was outnumbered and outgunned, that the poacher and his men were seasoned hunters with no qualms about taking a life. But he also knew that he had something they didn't, a connection to the land, a deep understanding of the mountains and the creatures that called them home. He had spent years learning to read the signs, to track animals through the dense underbrush. And he had the bear on his side, a creature of strength and power that had already proven its resilience. As if on cue, a low growl echoed from inside the cabin, a sound that sent shivers down the spines of the poacher's men. They glanced at each other uneasily, their grip on their weapons loosening slightly. Carter's eyes flicked towards the cabin, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He knew that the bear was still weak, still healing from its injuries. But he also knew that it would fight to protect him, just as he was fighting to protect it. Last chance, he said, his voice calm and steady. Walk away now, and we can all go on with our lives. The poacher's face twisted into a sneer, his eyes blazing with anger. You think you can scare me with a few growls? He spat, taking a step forward. I've hunted creatures twice the size of that bear, taken them down with my bare hands. And I'll do the same to you, if you don't get out of my way. Carter's grip tightened on his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was running out of options, that the situation was spiraling out of control. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not now, not when everything he had fought for was on the line. Then you'll have to go through me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I promise you, I won't make it easy. The poacher's face contorted with rage, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. But before he could fire, a sudden movement caught everyone's attention. The door of the cabin burst open, and the bear emerged, its eyes blazing with a fierce determination. The poacher's men stumbled backwards, their eyes wide with fear, but the poacher himself only laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the mountains. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Looks like the cavalry has arrived. But it's too little, too late, Reeves. You and your pet are both going down." And with that, he raised his rifle, ready to take the shot that would end everything. Carter braced himself, knowing that he only had one chance, one moment to make a difference. And as the world seemed to slow down around him, he knew exactly what he had to do. In a flash, Carter dove to the side, just as the poacher's bullet whizzed past his ear. He hit the ground hard, rolling to his feet and bringing his own rifle to bear. But the poacher was fast, his reflexes honed by years of hunting. He sidestepped Carter's shot, a cruel smile playing across his face. "Is that the best you can do, Reeves?" he taunted, circling around Carter like a predator stalking its prey. "I thought you were supposed to be some kind of legend out here, a man who could take on anything the mountains could throw at him." Carter gritted his teeth, his eyes never leaving the poacher's face. He knew that he was outmatched, that the poacher had years of experience and a team of men at his back. But he also knew that he had something the poacher could never understand, a bond with the bear, a connection that went beyond mere words. As if sensing his thoughts, the bear let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. It charged forward, its massive paws churning up the earth as it barreled towards the poacher and his men. The poacher's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face for the first time. He raised his rifle, ready to take the shot that would end the bear's life. But Carter was faster, his own bullet tearing through the air and slamming into the poacher's shoulder. The poacher stumbled backwards, his rifle falling from his grasp. His men scattered, their courage failing in the face of the bear's fury. But the poacher himself only laughed, a harsh, grating sound that set Carter's teeth on edge. "You think you've won, Reeves?" he spat, clutching at his wounded shoulder. "You think that bear can protect you forever? I'll be back, and next time I won't be alone." Carter's grip tightened on his rifle, his jaw clenched with determination. "And I'll be waiting," he said, his voice low and steady. "As long as I have breath in my body, I'll protect this land and everything on it." The poacher's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something like respect crossing his face. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll see." And with that, he turned and limped away, his men following close behind. Carter watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the battle was far from over, but for now he had won. The bear stood beside him, breathing heavily but uninjured. It looked up at Carter, its dark eyes filled with something that almost felt like gratitude. Carter reached out and placed a hand on its thick fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breath. "You saved me," he murmured. "I guess that makes us even." The bear let out a low rumbling sound, something between a growl and a purr, before turning its gaze toward the forest. Carter knew what it meant. The time had come. For days, he had been dreading this moment, but he had always known it was inevitable. The bear had healed. It no longer belonged in the confines of his cabin, no matter how much he wished otherwise. He had kept it safe just as it had protected him, but now it needed to return to where it belonged. Carter took a step back, his throat tightening. "Go on," he said softly. "You're free." The bear hesitated for just a moment, then turned and began to walk away. Its massive form disappeared into the trees, blending into the wilderness like a shadow. Carter stood there, watching long after it was gone, feeling a strange hollowness settle in his chest. For years, he had lived in solitude, convinced he needed no one. But now, for the first time, he felt truly alone. He let out a slow breath and turned back toward his cabin, expecting the familiar emptiness to greet him. But something had changed. The air felt different, lighter somehow. The walls that had once felt like a prison no longer seemed so suffocating. A knock on the door startled him. He opened it to find the young woman from before, the one he had given supplies to, the one who had needed his help. "I heard what happened," she said hesitantly. The The bear, everything. I just wanted to say thank you. Carter nodded, unsure of what to say. She hesitated, then smiled. You know, the town could use someone like you. Someone who understands the land, someone who cares. Maybe you don't have to be up here all alone. Carter glanced past her, toward the trail that led down to the town he had spent years avoiding. He had built his life around walls, physical and emotional. But the bear had taught him something important. Strength wasn't just about surviving alone. Sometimes it was about knowing when to let people in. Carter took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in years, he was willing to find out. With one last glance at the forest, he stepped forward. Carter hesitated at the threshold of his cabin, the woman's words lingering in the cold mountain air. The idea of returning to town, of stepping back into a world he had long abandoned, unsettled him. Yet, something deep inside stirred, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He exhaled sharply and nodded. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The woman smiled faintly. "That's more than I expected." She turned to leave, but then stopped. "My name's Evelyn, by the way. In case you ever decide to come down to town, you'll know at least one person who won't turn you away." Carter watched her disappear into the trees, her form vanishing just as the bear had. He stood there for a long time, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, staring at the path that led down the mountain. Finally, with a tired sigh, he turned back inside. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. For weeks, he had gotten used to the sound of the bear's steady breathing, the way it shuffled slightly in its sleep. Now, the silence pressed down on him like a weight. Carter moved to the chair by the fire, rubbing his hands together. He had no reason to leave. His supplies were well stocked, the land provided for him, and he had spent years perfecting the art of isolation. And yet, his eyes drifted to the empty spot where the bear had once rested. Days passed, and Carter found himself venturing farther into the woods, following familiar trails with no particular destination. He told himself he was simply ensuring no more poachers had wandered onto his land. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was searching for a sign of the bear. At night, he would sit outside his cabin, listening to the sounds of the wilderness, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustling of leaves as the wind carried secrets through the trees. But there was no sign of the creature that had changed everything. Then, one morning, just as the sun began to crest the horizon, he heard it, a deep, resonant growl, echoing from the ridge beyond his cabin. Carter's heart leaped into his throat. He moved quickly, slipping through the trees with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years navigating the mountain. When he crested the ridge, his breath caught in his chest. The bear stood there, just beyond the tree line, its massive form framed by the golden morning light. But it was not alone. Two smaller shapes huddled close to its side. Carter inhaled sharply. Cubs. The realization struck him like a hammer. The bear had been a mother. A strange, unfamiliar emotion welled up inside him. Pride, relief, something else he couldn't quite define. He had helped her survive, and now, she had returned not as a wounded creature in need of saving, but as something stronger. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the bear dipped its head, a silent acknowledgement. Carter swallowed past the lump in his throat. He wanted to step forward to close the distance between them, but he knew better. This was where they parted ways, for real this time. He nodded back. The bear turned, nudging one of the cubs forward with her nose. And then, just as quietly as she had come, she disappeared into the trees, her cubs following closely behind. Carter stood there for a long time, watching the spot where she had been. He felt lighter somehow, as if something inside him had shifted. He had spent years convincing himself that survival meant solitude. But now he wasn't so sure. With a final glance at the woods, he turned and made his way down the mountain, toward town. Carter's descent into town was slow and deliberate. Each step felt foreign, as if he were treading into a past life that no longer fit him. The town of Pine Hollow had changed in his absence, though he wasn't sure if it had changed more or if he had. As he reached the outskirts, he noticed the wary glances from those who still remembered the cold and unapproachable man he had once been. He wasn't surprised. His reputation had been built over years of isolation and harshness. It would take time to dismantle. His feet carried him toward the general store, the place he had once stormed into only when necessity demanded it, never lingering, never speaking more than a few words. The bell jingled as he stepped inside, and the warmth of the shop wrapped around him. Behind the counter, an older man with graying hair looked up. Henry Lawson, a man Carter had once done business with back when money, power, and control had been his only priorities. "Well, I'll be damned," Henry muttered, setting down a crate of supplies. "Carter Reeves. Thought the mountains swallowed you up for good." Carter exhaled, his fingers curling slightly. He had expected this. "Not yet," he replied. Henry eyed him carefully before nodding toward the shelves. "What can I do for you?" Carter scanned the store, his gaze settling on the basic supplies. Flour, beans, dried meat, medical kits. The things he used to take without much thought now carried a different weight. He reached for a bag of rice but hesitated. Then, surprising even himself, he said, "I want to pay for Evelyn's supplies. The ones she took for her father." Henry's brows lifted slightly. "That's so?" Carter nodded. "She didn't have a choice." "I did." Henry studied him for a moment before shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "Well, ain't that something?" He rang up the total and pushed the receipt toward Carter. "Evelyn will be grateful. Might not trust it at first, but grateful all the same." Carter reached into his worn leather satchel, pulling out the necessary bills. He had little left from his past life, but it didn't matter. As Henry handed over the change, he leaned in slightly. "People talk, you know. Word spreading that you helped that girl, that you stood up to those poachers." Carter met his gaze. "And what are they saying?" Henry shrugged. "Some think you're up to something. Others think you've finally grown a conscience." Carter huffed a quiet laugh. "Maybe both." He turned to leave, but Henry's voice stopped him. "There's a barn on the edge of town, Old Miller Place," Henry said. "A group of us have been trying to fix it up for a shelter. We could use an extra pair of hands." Carter stilled. For years, people had needed his skills for profit, for destruction, for ambition. Never for something like this. He glanced out the window, past the town square, past the familiar streets, toward the distant peaks of the mountains. The bear had returned to its world, and now maybe it was time for him to return to his. "I'll think about it," he said. Henry smirked. "That's more than I expected." Carter left the store, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. The town still looked at him with suspicion, but now, he saw something else in their gazes. Curiosity, maybe even hope. With his supplies in hand, he turned toward the trail back to his cabin. The mountains would always be a part of him, but for the first time in years, he realized they weren't his prison. They were simply home, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to live there alone. Carter returned to his cabin that evening, his mind filled with thoughts that refused to settle. The mountains had always been his refuge, a place where he could exist without expectation or obligation. But after today, he knew something had shifted. He set his supplies on the worn wooden table and stared at the flickering fire. The bear had left, and yet its presence lingered in ways he hadn't expected. The way it had trusted him, the way it had looked at him with understanding. Those moments had become embedded in him, impossible to ignore. Days passed, and Carter found himself standing at the edge of the mountain trail more often than he cared to admit. Each time, he considered walking back into town, answering Henry's call for help. Each time, something held him back. Then one afternoon, he saw movement at the base of the trail. Evelyn. She was walking toward him, bundled in a coat against the crisp autumn air, carrying a small basket. Carter frowned, stepping forward to meet her. "You lost?" he asked, though his voice lacked the sharpness it once held. Evelyn smirked. "Not anymore." She extended the basket. "Henry told me what you did. Paying for the medicine." Carter hesitated before taking it. Inside were freshly baked biscuits and a small jar of honey. "You didn't have to do this." Evelyn shrugged. "And you didn't have to help." But you did. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling through the trees. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. I meant what I said before, about the town needing someone like you. We're not asking you to be something you're not, Carter. Just think about it. She turned and made her way back down the trail, leaving Carter alone with his thoughts. That night, he sat outside his cabin, staring up at the stars. He thought about the man he had been, the man he had become, and the man he still wasn't sure he could be. But something inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. The next morning, he packed a small bag, locked up the cabin, and started down the trail toward town. 1 year later, Pine Hollow had changed, or maybe Carter had. The barn Henry had mentioned was now a fully operational shelter, a safe haven for those in need. Carter had spent months helping rebuild it, hammering nails, reinforcing beams, and learning the quiet satisfaction that came with working alongside others. At first, people had kept their distance. They were polite, cautious, waiting for the Carter Reeves they remembered to reemerge. But over time, trust replaced suspicion. He didn't expect them to forget who he had once been. He didn't need them to. But he had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about proving day by day that he was more than his worst mistakes. Evelyn had been right. He hadn't changed overnight. But something in him had healed, just like the bear. And speaking of the bear, on certain mornings, before the sun fully crested the mountain, Carter would take long walks into the woods. He never went looking for it, but sometimes he would catch a glimpse. A massive, shadowy figure moving between the trees, two smaller cubs now grown at its side. They never approached, never lingered too long. But Carter knew, somewhere in the depths of the forest, the bear remembered him, just as he would always remember it. And with that, he finally understood. They had both found their way home. End of story.